World Watchers. I am Mae Brussell, broadcast number 835, December the 7th, 1987. Before I get into the main part of the program, I do want to mention two things. One, that on KFJC, the program up in Los Altos that has played World Watchers for over 7 years, David Emery has put it on. I offered the same suggestion to them at their fundraising that I've had with Kazoo, that the first 15 listeners that called in and pledged $100 or more to the station would be invited to my home for a potluck dinner. Now, David Emery has given me your names. There's 15 names and your telephone numbers. I can't call all of you. I don't have your addresses, and I want to get them so I can get the invitations out to you with the directions to get to my house, but we'll have to work around what we have now because the weeks go pretty quickly. John Judge is in town. He's in San Francisco. He lives in Washington, and he's going to be at my home December the 17th, Friday night, December 17th. So those of you that are part of this arrangement up at KFJC, send me a self-addressed stamped envelope, and I will tell you, give a map on how to get to my house. The dinner will be at 7 in the evening on Friday, December 17th. So you send me a self-addressed stamped envelope. If you don't have my address, it is P.O. Box 22511, Carmel, 93922. Send me a self-addressed stamped envelope. Keep the 17th open, Friday the 17th, and John will be down from San Francisco, and you can come to the house, and we'll have this potluck dinner. This is December the 7th, and 7 years ago, December the 7th, 1980, I did a broadcast number 470, and part of that broadcast reminded people, in case they had short memories, the subject was the assassination teams from the early 60s are all in place, if not part of the murders, all part of the cover-up. And I listed certain people as heads of former assassination teams and how they would come down once Ronald Reagan was inaugurated, which would be in 4 weeks from that time. That was December the 7th. And then the next morning or late that evening, John Lennon was murdered on officially December the 8th, 1980, one day later. And I mentioned such people as Ronald Reagan and Paul Exalt and John J. McCloy and Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford and John Tower and Richard Allen and Howard Baker and Richard Vagary as being part of that group. And some of those names you know. The two people that have stayed very quiet these years that Reagan's been in office are Ed Davis from the Los Angeles Police Department, who's a senator in California, and Evil Younger, the former Attorney General of the state. Oh, Evil Younger didn't go back to Washington as part of that entourage around Reagan when he became president, and he has stayed very, very silent all of these years for one reason or another. But I did about 4 broadcasts on John Lennon and then updated it later, the conspiracy behind John Lennon's murder. And I believed at the time, I said that he could rally people for peace at a time when this administration was going for war. Now, just this past week, the president shocked the world, and particularly those in America, by saying, as an introduction to his meeting with Mr. Gorbachev and the summit meetings, that there were people in his administration and around him, surrounding him, who believe that World War III is inevitable. And I'll do more on that in a minute regarding the summit. But what I was saying at the time John Lennon was murdered was that he was a symbol of peace. He and Yoko Ono, for whatever it was worth, they were symbolic of the peace movement, and they could rally 1 million people separately or combined, the Beatles, within 24 hours and have large rallies, and that this administration was hell-bent towards war, and I still think they are, and the summit is nice to be happy about, but reduce it to the realities of what's going on, and it's scary to see the street theater and put people at ease continuously over things that have no contact with reality. The reality are the weapons that are being made and deployed at the present time. I've been giving a list of magazines and books that are available for the holidays, of Christmas presents, and gave you the addresses. Many of you sent self-addressed stamped envelopes, and I gave you where to subscribe or order these publications. There are also a lot of good videotapes out, and some other material. I want to give you 3 more references. I hope you have your pencil handy. There is one company that is called Fusion Video, and it's toll-free, 1-800-338-7710. It's 24-hour, toll-free, and then they'll give you the address and maybe a catalog. Some of the videos they have available, one is Mein Kampf, a visual hour-and-a-half movie on the rise of Hitler. The other is Inside the Company Business. These are 3 tapes on the CIA, the Bay of Pigs, and political assassinations and the role of the CIA. One video is called The Kennedys, a definitive look at one of America's most powerful families. Another one is McCarthy, Death of a Witch Hunter. And this is the story of Senator Joe McCarthy, directed by Emil De Antonio. That's the gentleman who made the effort to spring Fritz Kramer and Sepp Dietrich and Joachim Peiper out of the Dachau prison. Take a look at him. And another one that I mentioned last week that I had bought, of Pure Blood, the story of creating a super race for the Germans, is on this catalog. 10 Days That Shook the World. This is Orson Welles with John Reed. And you can get The Confessions of Bernard Goetz, a 90-minute movie, the videotape, the great Bernard Goetz. But they have a big collection here, and the number is 1-800-338-7710, and you can bring history into your living room. And if you want to call a TV number for another history into your living room, for a videotape of Ollie North, the advertisement says, "Feel his appeal to stop Soviet Union's establishing a terrorist base in our backyard. See the slideshow that Congress wouldn't let you see. Hear the people who knew Ollie the best." That tape is $25 if you can stand it. 1-800-526-5000. And then for those of you who are in keeping with the material that I've been having lately on Satan and Heinrich Himmler's Castle and the Waffen-SS and the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff and the War College, you can get some books and tape cassettes and flags and pins from the New Order. It's called the New Order, Box 6414, Lincoln, Nebraska, 68506. You can get flags, mini flags of the Waffen-SS, the Third Reich battle flag, the SS headquarters, the SS Panzer. You can get pins with the swastikas. You can get medallions to wear around your neck with the skull and crossbones or the flags of the Waffen-SS. And they have armbands, if you're armbands, and historical books, and books on race, and books on the enemy, and politics and philosophy. Send for a list of their material, swastika flags, and you can get the German marching songs of the Third Reich. And Dr. Joseph Goebbels Speaks, 90 minutes, and Sieg Heil, War Songs, and Triumph of the Will. An SS skull, that medallion on the chain, is a bargain. It's only $6.50, and the SS-style dagger is $29.95, and Hitler's knife is $12.50. That's a copy, of course. And your SS officer collar tabs are $11.50. Swastika stick pins are $3.50. You can regale yourself out just like Michael Aquino does from the Defense Department with his Nazi uniforms and armbands and pins and his videotapes of the Waffen-SS. If you want to know how to get them, there are dealer discounts, but at retail, the prices are listed in the catalog, and you can regale yourself out in full Nazi uniform and listen and march, just like G. Gordon Liddy did with Robert Mardian of the Justice Department at the Watergate, and I say did in the past tense. I'm sure he's still doing it now. Well, the summit is taking place. Mr. Gorbachev is in town, and by the time any of you get this tape, the summit will have been over, and I just want to share a few comments about it. The Washington Times had an article last week, November 24th, armed U.S. Navy bombers fly mock raids at Soviet base. For the first time, Operation Shooting Star had our Air Force and our military practicing the targets of a Russian city and going after the Soviet Union. It's the first time that we have mock raids at the Soviet bases, that we are rehearsing to get to the Soviet bases. Also, the New York Times had a story this week. Swiss are ready to face Armageddon in comfort, and this is called Operation Ant, the $28 million shelter that was built, and they've been adding on more. That $28 million was up until 1976, and they're updating it. And in these shelters, they have 4 350-ton concrete doors that are going to seal them off from the rest of the world and provide protection from blast and radiation. And you can stay in there. They have music. They say no rock music. It would be too disconcerting. Soothing music. And the shelter will have special rations and closed-circuit radio and bed and so forth, saving you from chemical, biological weapons. Operation Ants is ready to go, and the news people have been invited to see it. Also, I've mentioned a book called Armed and Dangerous, The Rise of the Survivalist Right. That has to do with the military and the same people that are involved in the bringing about the Fourth Reich, if they can. And the title of one of these book reviews is Rooting for Armageddon. So while there are a lot of people hoping the summit will have worked this past week, there's a lot of people who are rooting for Armageddon and some that have already been making their provisions. The San Francisco Chronicle had a story this week, Conservatives Blast Reagan's Arms Treaty. And many of you saw how they were complaining that Reagan was testing their loyalty, that he was making statements that didn't pertain to them, and that he said that down in their deepest thoughts, these people have accepted war is inevitable. Well, you don't have to be so smart to figure that out. As a matter of fact, several broadcasts I cited from the Washington Post had the weapons and the plans for World War III, and then the next plans, the budget, is already into World War IV. So the Defense Department does think war is inevitable, and the far right are accusing Reagan of being a complete sellout. The anger of his own group has turned against him. They put him into power not to make deals with the evil empire, but to keep whipping their butt until they are weak and down on the ground begging for mercy. The groups that opposed him gave themselves a title now. It's called the AAA, and it's not Alcoholics Anonymous. It's the Anti-Appeasement Alliance that issued a statement about Reagan and his foreign policy, and they said the president may have abandoned his earlier position, but we have not. The AAA is a group of very far right-wing people that feel that he has abandoned them by meeting with Mr. Gorbachev, and of course you know the names that have been in the news castigating him for the things that he is doing. Besides members of the Senate, there's Howard Phillips, and the very far right. Howard Phillips says he's an apologist for Mikhail Gorbachev. Ronald Reagan is a weak man with a strong wife and a strong staff, and of course you saw the quotation calling him a useful idiot. This is coming from the far right. And Brent Bozell of the Conservative, he's chairman of the Conservative Victory Committee, said, I speak for millions of conservatives who fought for years to put this man in the White House. And when I say that the president insulted the conservative movement last night by saying that they even would think about war as being inevitable and so forth, he says we have been abandoned. The movement has been abandoned by Ronald Reagan. We didn't leave him. He left us. Well, the AAA, the Anti-Appeasement Alliance, may or may not coincidentally have the same initials as the death squad set up outside of Madrid with Otto Skorzeny in Central and South America, and the very people that were working, arming our Contras down in Central America. The AAA in South America is the Alianza Anticomunista Apostolica. That's the 3 A's, and that's set up by Mr. Stefano Delle Chiaie, Otto Skorzeny, and Francesco Pazienza, Licio Gelli. These are the death squads that have eliminated the middle class, the labor leaders, the professors, and taking away women and children. And also in Spain, there is the 3A, the Anti-Communist Alliance. There's the Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance, and then the other Alianza Anticomunista Apostolica in Spain. All of them set up by way of the CIA export-import offices in Madrid, and such characters as Michele Sindona and Francesco Pazienza, and the death squads in Italy, responsible for the Bologna bombing, individual or mass murders, and other bombings in Italy coming from the far right. They tried to pass it off on the left. Those death squads use the 3A as their initials. And the thing we have to worry about in this country is that Anti-Appeasement Alliance. They are armed and dangerous, just as that title of the book, Armed and Dangerous, ready for the Armageddon, the survivalist right. because these people have collected in offshore banking and Swiss banks money for the kinds of uniforms I was reading about earlier that you can order from the order. They are trained approximately every 20 miles from each other. They are the survivalists, the posse comitatus, and when they stop taking or fighting those wars overseas in Vietnam, Angola, and Afghanistan, the war is going to be at home. Mr. Richard Butler, who is the head of the Aryan Nations, was a Lockheed engineer. He worked on the U-2 program before he began his Aryan Nations, Armed and Dangerous. And the far right has very strong links to the Defense Department. So watching the far right have the mouthpiece, Howard Phillips, referring to the president as an idiot and a weak man, is just the beginning of breaking down the American presidency, as bad as it is, and it's falling apart. This can be very dangerous. And Richard Vagary was the gentleman who absolutely was so elated when Ronald Reagan ran the presidency. And he says, now we feel alienated, abandoned, and rejected by the president. And that's one thing the president can't do, because that's why he is their president. That's why they went to so much trouble to kill or get rid of the other people in his way, to have the power they wanted. And they didn't want a weak man. Richard Nixon became weak going to China and Russia. When everything else was crumbling, he bargained from a position of weakness. And with the Iran-Contra affair, Reagan is bargaining from a position of weakness. And the Avengers, the very mean people who vowed never, never to have anything less than a war with those people, are not going to take Ronald Reagan seriously these last few months of his administration, no matter what is signed on a piece of paper. And the treaty that they were flying over today from Switzerland only has to do with 4% of the nuclear weapons anyway. As I mentioned, Brent Bozell was angry, and the top spokesmen who were absolutely elated when Reagan was in office are now demolished and crushed by the thing that he's doing this last twilight of office. For the United States, at the bargaining table, the missile table, whatever you want to call it, we have representatives. The easy, soft side, if you can generalize, are George Shultz, Howard Baker, Max Campbellman, and Roseanne Ridgway has a position there she's not seen very often. I don't know whether she's a Jean Kirkpatrick type. She's Assistant Secretary of State of European and Canadian Affairs, and she's not a Soviet arms control expert, and you see her up at the microphone now giving briefings at press conferences. On the other side of our U.S. team, take away those four names, the hardliners are Frank Carlucci, who still has this strange relationship with the faceless Erich von Marbod, as faceless as Fritz Kramer. Carlucci linked to Task Force 157 and the secret team. Ken Duberstein of the National Security Council. Jack Matlock of the National Security Council, who was received as the savior of the NSC with the notorious Fritz Kramer in January when Reagan's problems began to come unraveled. I mentioned Matlock as the hardliner of the NSC. Paul Nietzsche is part of the American Committee. That guy is only 80 years old, 80. And he's been at every one of these kinds of meetings since 1944. The Nazis went underground 1933 to 44. Nietzsche has been part of these hearings, and we've been on the brink or closer to the deployment of all kinds of weapons and actual war many times. And that old goat sits there, and so does Lieutenant General Colin Powell. Powell was part of the Ollie North Fawn Hall destruction of papers and documents. He was allowed to come in a position of weakness. Of the President of the United States has allowed a black national security advisor there, but he's had 5 changes, and as he's winding down his affairs, he is letting him have the power, and he was a good team player with Fawn Hall and Oliver North, and goodness knows what those papers would have showed if he didn't allow them to tear them up or put them in the shredder, and all of them were party of the same problem. Now, Fletcher Prouty, L. Fletcher Prouty, who wrote The Secret Team, has an article in the New Federalist this week. He writes for Lyndon LaRouche. Don't fall off your chair and be shocked by it. The New Federalist is the newspaper. It used to be New Solidarity. He writes for it often. He was the liaison of the Defense Department to the intelligence community, flew Franklin Roosevelt to the Yalta and Tehran conferences, and he's writing for the New Federalist. There's some researchers that say Mae, you can't quote. Well, I don't take orders. I've told you that before. I'm a friend of Fletcher's, known him for years, and he writes in this paper. His articles are always interesting. He also writes for Liberty Lobby. He has an article called Yalta Revisited, Is Reagan Fit for the Summit? And he goes on to say that does it ask too much for those responsible officials and friends around the president to make some distinction between what natural senile senescence is, with its narrowing of interest, rigidity, conservatism, and lapse of memory, but look at Ronald Reagan with his gross failures of judgment, with his decision to send arms to Iran, his logic about sending arms to Iran or no hostages taken. He said there's a gross failure of judgment, of social misconduct, all of which may indicate brain failure, perhaps dementia itself. Can't they seek the best medical assistance and go in to see if he has a brain problem? And I've talked about that before, and there's Dr. Walsh in Los Angeles and Beverly Hills who says the same thing about the brain condition Ronald Reagan. And Fletcher Prouty is saying this is very serious business. He may have dementia, which is a gross impairment of intellect in an individual who previously was considered normal despite his age. And there is a problem about his not being able to talk without reading things, with blowing it and saying very strange things when he's alone and so forth. And L. Fletcher Prouty, who's been to 2 of these peace summits towards the end of World War II, is looking at Ronald Reagan and feeling there's something really wrong. And it's wonderful to have peace and sign a piece of paper. And Mr. Gorbachev is taking the moment and using it because this is the moment of weakness of the president. But people later can come back and null the whole agreement by saying he was senile and he didn't know what he was doing, just like they said he had a great recovery when he was in the hospital, when he had the first cancer operation, and when he was shot also, and he didn't have a great recovery. He was very sick. It was a very long recovery period. They were lying then, and some people are going to come out of the White House and say that you weren't told the truth now, that what he signed isn't worth a piece of paper. And these people that feel that war is inevitable are right behind there, breathing down his back. Now, I want to do the rest of this program on some articles about Satanism of Michael Aquino, the Church of Set in San Francisco. I've done several, and this is a subject that could go on for many, many months. And then I will be getting into the book, The Ultimate Evil, the one on Son of Sam and the links to the Manson family. There's an article in 1984, 3 years ago, by Ira Leibowitz in New Solidarity called War on Drugs, Who's Behind the Satanic Murder Cults? And this was written, as I say, I've had it, and many of these articles, this was 3 years ago, I've had a lot of articles on these things and didn't realize, truthfully, the seriousness of this matter. And now I'm going back and finding these stories and putting them together and adding it up. And it's truly more important and more serious than I realized at the time. In this story, it refers to a killing in Long Island, in Northrop, Long Island, June 16, 1984, which was a satanic murder. It was done by the Knights of the Black Circle, about 20 teenagers. And the Aleister Crowley network, this is a man who came over here from London, set up a network that got itself involved into these satanic cult operations after he came to the United States. This article says there's an underground group, a network of satanic cult, that they show up in bookstores, at rock musics, at part of the counterculture, and they refer to the Hells Angels, who are now on trial, and a lot of different members of these cults or groups that seem to link together. The British Satanist Aleister Crowley came to the United States in 1944. After World War II, he recruited teenage subcultures and started using satanic music. Now, 1943 to 44 is when the Nazis started going underground. Sir William Stevenson came here from British intelligence to merge with our OSS. And Aleister Crowley was sent from London and Switzerland, where he lived, to form the OTO. He founded OTO, that's called, its initials for Ordo Templis Orientalis, in Pasadena, California, and it's linked to Israel's Francis Regard Order of the Golden Dawn that they have in Israel. Crowley Network not only was in California and Pasadena, but this article said it was connected to the Church of Set in parentheses referring to Horus, and I'll go into the explanation of those terms in a little while. But in San Francisco, the Church of Set, which is Michael Aquino when he was in the armed forces at the time this was written, and even out there at the Presidio, where the nursery school later would be involved in these child molestation cases. Michael Aquino was part of the military, and this author was writing about the Church of Set in 1984, and the article also goes into Anton LaVey from the Church of Satan in San Francisco, and LaVey is the links to the Manson family and Son of Sam, and it says that the satanic group stretches from Laurie Carrott's and Queen Juliana's witch museums that are in Salem, Massachusetts, to Scotland, to Herman Slater, and to a group in Atlanta, Georgia, the bookstore of the Old Religion and the Wicca in Atlanta, Georgia, and Anton LaVey in San Francisco, and also his base in Atlantic City. And I mentioned that because there were a whole lot of children and incidences of children missing right in New Jersey outside of Atlantic City. This article says these satanic atrocities have been appearing, such as the one at Northrop, Long Island, and they're put together by vigilantes of the right wing, and this is the theater of fascist revival. These satanic groups have similarities to the Thule Society that provided Nazism with its ideology, and these particular Knights of the Black Circle killed one of their members because of some drug deals, and the satanic rituals, according to this article, have to do with digging up remains in the graveyards, getting the skulls, and selling the human skulls in return for drug money. The drugs are paid off with skulls, and this article going back 3 years ago goes into the Church of Set and how people are slaughtered and mutilated. And this one particular person that was killed in Long Island had his eyes cut out, 17-year-old, and it goes into animal sacrifices that the groups are doing, and also personal and grave digging and human sacrifice is part of the group. And it goes into quite lurid details about during the Son of Sam murders in 1977-78, it was brought out that David Berkowitz followed the writing of the OTO Satanist Aleister Crowley and was linked to Carl Jung and certain centers of magic and so forth. And the centers have been involved with animal mutilations, some in Dudley, Massachusetts, others in Thompson, Vermont, and the discovery of human skeletons and fetus in Hollywood at the Ram Occult Bookstore and so forth. So this article was on to the Church of Set and Thomas Aquino and the links to the origin of Nazism, and that was also the links to Heinrich Himmler and the castle, the Westphalia Castle, that Michael Aquino does his ceremonies and satanic rituals in Himmler's castle, which is pretty scary because he's still in Army uniform, and we'll see if anything comes out of that Presidio case. The powers that be in San Francisco don't even touch him. We'll take a 1-minute break right now before I continue with the rest of this program of World Watchers. And I did want to say that one person came to the potluck that I had two of them for kazoo, and I don't want to put his name on the air. He brought me a book, which I appreciated, called R-Type West. Turn your tape over, I'll announce that this is the second half of that program. Regarding the summit, I'm interested in why Ronald Reagan is having it, and there's a lot of conflicts that Nancy is influencing him. And I did want to mention that all through the year, starting in 1986, I felt that Reagan was very much in a position of weakness going down all the way. I thought maybe he could be impeached. He obviously never will be touched in that sense, our Teflon president. But there were events that I felt were done to affect his presidency, and I feel that this sudden meeting and this change of mind about weapon agreements with the Soviet Union could come because it's its last chance to save face and have a presidency that's remembered at least for something. And if he goes to Russia and signs some more treaties and agreements there, that will be 2 summits, and he will be remembered for those. The last one was a disaster. Now, I felt the moment of weakness for this president began with Chernobyl, May the 9th, 1986, when that exploded, and 10 people in the Soviet Union were indicted for violation errors and are in jail. And I felt that we, people inside of the Soviet Union, our spy system, Reinhard Gehlen's system, could have done this because it was one of the most damaging things psychologically and politically that happened to the Soviet Union. Next came the Cameroon explosion, the neutron bomb in August, a few months later, 3 months later, and I believe the Soviet Union got a message right there loud and clear because all of Europe is talking about the neutron bomb, and next week I'm going to update that for you, following up this summit with the story of what's really going on in Europe. And the man who mentioned the neutron bomb in the London Times, Mordecai Vanunu, has been secreted away, and nobody can see him, hear from him, or get any sign language to him. The men responsible for Chernobyl are indicted and locked up. Mordecai Vanunu in Israel is not seen at all. Nicholas Danilov was the third event that happened to Ronald Reagan and to this government. He was arrested August 31st, and we don't hear much from Danilov. And each of these events I did 2 or 3 or 4 broadcasts on, and I believe these are what led to the summit. The Reykjavik summit was called hurriedly after Danilov was arrested and released. That was October the 3rd, and Reagan came home unprepared and damning the Russians and getting in the car and cursing, and he was literally forced to meet there, but very little was accomplished. And then 2 days later, Eugene Hassenfuss landed in Nicaragua, and the 4th man on that plane still has not been identified. That's been a year and 2 months, and the 4th passenger, I've asked Danny Sheehan and all written letters to Washington, can't find out who that 4th person was, so I know it has to be important. And then November the 3rd, the Lebanese paper Al Shira printed the story of the United States sending arms to Iran, and the reporter who broke that story was shot in the head September 15th, 1987. So it was November 3rd, 86 that the paper had the story, and just 9 months later, 10 months later, he was shot in the head. So the Chernobyl people are locked up in jail. Vanunu is sequestered away. Danilov is pretty quiet. We don't hear from him. And the 4th man with Hassenfuss has never been exposed, and the reporter was shot in the head. And I believe that the victimizing of those people tied to these stories was because those were major events that affected our relationship with the Soviet Union and forced the president to come to the position he's at now. It doesn't matter how he got there, but the question is how long will it hold, given the mentality of people like Caspar Weinberger and the Richard Pearl and John Lehman and the very hardliners against the Soviet Union. I believe they've left the government to do their work on the outside, just as Richard Secord left the Air Force and was on no payroll to do his work for the National Security Council on the outside. They have things they have to account to and to Congress if they're in the government, and the very, very hardliners are leaving at this point, and they can do their damage on the outside looking in instead of on the inside having to explain what they're doing. So getting back to the material on the occult again and the problems of the origins of the occult, of these horrible things that are really difficult to understand, the story of human sacrifices and cannibalism and what's going on. There's a new book out called Aleister Crowley, The Nature of the Beast, The Life and Ideas of the Wickedest Man in the World. Now, Aleister Crowley, Crowley, is supposed to be the father of New Age. You hear a lot about New Age music and New Age thinking and New Age philosophy. And the one thing that you don't get in New Age is New Age politics. You can do anything but, and you can think of yourself, but you're not supposed to be thinking politically or singing politically. You can be neutralized to not have these high emotions, and it doesn't matter. The music will soothe you. The movement just gives you a introspection of yourself, but you're not supposed to be of this world or the outside, although Aleister Crowley, the father of the New Age, so to speak, was very active in many, many ways. And in this book, on page 157, it describes, Colin Wilson quotes one of his friends, female admirers, who said there was a very close resemblance between Crowley and Adolf Hitler. And this book goes into his Aquarian projects that have been compared to the way that Nazism came about and the forces and the eruption of Nazism. And this book hides, according to a review I have, the sympathies of the fascist ideology of Crowley. Colin Wilson secretly really admires him. He's written a lot of books himself on the New Age. But he quotes different parts of Crowley's life, things that Crowley wrote about. For example, Wilson, his explanation of Crowley's revival says that how can you account for a man who describes his feelings as being, he died in 1947. He came to this to this country in 1944. But people describe his feelings as appealing to the flower power of the 1960s, the hatred of authority, the movements that led to do your own thing, and even encouraged Charles Manson, the Hells Angels. They looked to him as a kind of a god. And Wilson, in this book, quotes Crowley, who wrote a story where he says after the World War II, there was a strong revival in the interest of occultism. And I say he lived till 1947, till the year the CIA was formed. He had notes that a witch in the United Kingdom, Gerald Gardner, had by the 1950s identified dozens of covens, groups of witches practicing all over England, and he said they were followers of a nature religion called Wicca. But Gardner, who was interested in Wicca and the nature religion of Wicca, was a close friend of Crowley's and an intimate of Crowley's church, the OTO, in Pasadena. Crowley authorized Gardner to set up his own magical group. Gardner liked being flagellated, and his version of Wicca laid heavy emphasis on sex rites, in which everyone was nude, and they quickly gained lots of disciples. And, of course, this reminds me of Alfred Bloomingdale and Vicki Morgan and the same things that were going on with Ronald Reagan and his best friends, very close into the White House circles. They were supposed to be part of these same parties. But Crowley's version of magic, according to this new book, was evidenced in these covens, and many members of these groups studied seriously various systems and the magic of the Golden Dawn and Crowley's own systems. Crowley also talks about, in his books, he wrote a book called Magic in Theory and Practice, where he recommended sacrificing a male child to achieve the best magical results, and added a footnote to the effect, and I don't know how true this could possibly be, that he himself had done about 150 sacrifices of children each year between 1912 and 1928. Now, I added that up, and that would be a tremendous amount of missing children that were sacrificed. But Crowley, the father of the New Age, wrote this in his book, Magic in Theory and Practice. In another section of his book, early in 1980, he gave a lecture to the Poetry Society. 1930, Crowley gave a lecture to the Poetry Society at Oxford, quoting Giles de Rais, the 15th century child murderer, whom Crowley described as a practitioner of black magic and one that he admired, and quoted him. And the sympathies went to this man because of his child murders. And also in this book, Mr. Wilson says that Crowley's autobiography, Crowley informs us that his mother believed he was the beast, number 666 in the Apocalypse. And he said there was evidence that indicates that he was serious about the 666 and the beast, thought of himself as a counter-messiah, transcending and replacing Christ. And he used to torture and tear apart frogs and put daggers in them and call them Christ, and say he superseded them and was above them, and play the game of being greater than Christ. And this review of the book said, shouldn't we see in such passages the conceptual author today who's doing child kidnappings, ritual murders of children in Atlanta, Georgia, and this is one of the headquarters of the Satan group in Atlanta, Georgia, with child pornography, sexual abuse rings. And Mr. Wilson, in this book review of the book, says he doesn't bring out the Church of Satan in San Francisco, which is Michael Aquino of the Defense Department, of our Defense Department, and he has adopted Mr. Crowley's philosophy, do what thou wilt. That's the motto of Michael Aquino's Church of Set. So Mr. Crowley came to the United States in 1944, died in 1947. He was brought over here by Walter Taranti, a foreign correspondent of the New York Times. He had a strong link to Imperial Russia, to Tsarist Russia. He asked to be in the diplomatic service in Great Britain. He went to Cambridge University in 1895, was part of a cult group at Cambridge, a secret society, went to Imperial Russia, and then left Imperial Russia and came to the United States and to Pasadena, California, and was sort of the father or the man behind a large number of, like the Church of Satan and Anton LaVey. They took it over in California and in places in the United States, New Jersey and Atlanta, Georgia, and other cities where these became the headquarters for expressing the approval of or the necessity of the mutilations of pornography and the sacrifices that were brought over here through Mr. Crowley, Aleister Crowley, who is a hero of some people. I don't know who, but a good hard study of this man from Tsarist Russia to Pasadena, California, brought in a lot of the young people, and they followed him. And what has been going on with the indifference of the, I will say, the New Age, let's take it on, the people who absolutely say, we will not talk doom and gloom. It's almost a constant brainwashing. We will only talk and think peace and harmony, no doom and gloom. And yet the very people that set up these organizations, the people behind them, have plenty of doom and gloom and run a psychological warfare operation out of the Defense Department, out of Vietnam, out of organizations like the Church of Set, and then get all those other masses of people to be perfectly satisfied with this very soft music that doesn't challenge, doesn't throw you, doesn't involve conversation or memory or anything except sitting back and being mellow and not looking at the real world that's taking place outside. Now, there's an article in 1982 on Son of Sam. I'll do more of it later. It's titled, Killer Claims He Was the Cult's Trigger Man. Son of Sam was a gentleman who went around New York City killing people in 1977-78. The article said his name is David Berkowitz. David Berkowitz claimed Tuesday that he was a designated trigger man for a 20-member killer cult dedicated to violence, depravity, sex, and murder. And the group, the Knights group up in upstate New York that I started telling about with the sacrificial murders, that was a group of 20. They're broken in to specifically groups of 20, I suppose, and Berkowitz was a member of that group in New York. He made these assertions in the deposition he gave to his attorney on a civil suit regarding the families of the people he had wounded and killed in 1976-77. Berkowitz is serving 315 years to life. He claims that he was part of a cult. Half of the cult members, he said, eventually split between male and female, are now dead. There were 20 in his original group, and 10 are now dead, either through acts of violence or suicide. And a lot of this cult, satanic cult ritual, is now being explained for so many teenage suicides where families didn't even know they were part of the cult. The dead include John and Michael Carr, literally the sons of Sam Carr, his neighbor, David Berkowitz's neighbor. John Carr died in February 1978 at Minot Air Force Base. The Air Force Base was involved, if not in the murders, in the covering up. The military covered it up, and a man involved with David Berkowitz and his murders also was involved, the Manson family, and the common denominator between the two of those, and there were activities at Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota. The cult members were predominantly white-collar workers. 75% of them in the New York City areas were predominantly white. They killed animals as well as humans. They used hallucinogenic drugs. Although David Berkowitz bought the .44 caliber gun and ammunition for his slaying, the ammunition was kept by the cult and dispensed to him whenever he did the killings. He emphasized that he was the lone gunman on the attacks when he pleaded guilty, but he maintained that other members of his cult, 3 or 4 at a time, accompanied him as they hunted for their victims and served as lookouts for the killings. The victims were randomly picked, Berkowitz said. His cult associates assisted him in the selection process. Leipzig, whose clients Robert Violenti and Salvatore Lupino were injured in separate attacks by David Berkowitz during the summer, called on Governor Hugh Carey and district attorneys to reopen the investigation. That was 1982, and I understand that it's going to be opened again. Mr. Terry said that. Now, I mentioned several murders that happened a few years apart that were related to each other that weren't obvious at the time, but became related through different information and evidence. One murder was at Stanford campus. Several of these murders were at Stanford, 3 of them, and then 4 were related to each other. But the first murder took place at Stanford campus. A girl named Leslie Perloff. This was in February 1973, and attractive former Stanford co-ed, and she was working at the library, at the North County Law Library. She was employed as a clerk at Stanford. She was found on Old Page Mill Road, and she had been murdered, and they, as of this day, I don't think they have the person who killed Miss Perloff. And that was 1973, and I had saved articles. I was watching the instances of what is happening in California. And a woman came to me. She called me. She was doing indexing for Peter Dale Scott in the Bay Area, the writer and researcher. And around 1975, she came to me and asked me if she could help me do work and index my material and be a researcher. And I'm really pretty cautious about people coming to the house. She said she'd come down on a Sunday and meet me. I met her in San Francisco. Her first name is Julie. Her last initials are Muck. There's another part of that. I won't put it on the air, but I haven't seen her in years, so no purpose. First name's Julie. She had worked with Peter Dale Scott in the Bay Area. She came to my house, and instead of showing up alone, she arrived with two men, and one had a camera on his neck. And I said, what in the heck is going on here? And she said, well, this fellow, the one with the camera, he wants to stay with you. He's interested in the research, so he's keeping me company. But the other one, she was going to drive down to Point Lobos to do some skin diving. He was going to do diving off at Point Lobos. And before I could turn around, she drove away with this man and left me alone with the other one in my living room. And I said something was drastically wrong. They just turned around, got in the car, and drove away and left this character sitting in the living room. And I couldn't do anything with him. I didn't want to leave the room, and I didn't want to discuss the research. And I wouldn't let him leave the room. I just sat in the living room, and he sat staring at me, and I stared at him, and I was fuming at what she had done. And so anyway, she came back, luckily, left one down at the beach and came back, and I was screaming and yelling at her, why have you done this? And I was simply furious, and she took him away, and they drove away. And a couple of years later, it was a few years later, I can't remember the exact 2-3 years later, she called and told me that she felt very badly, that she had brought him there, that he was the person who had done the killing at the Stanford campus of the Perloff girl, and she should never have brought him to my house, and that in return for her doing that, she worked with people like E. Howard Hunt, who was in the CIA formerly, and Mr. William Buckley. They were co-partners in the CIA, and she felt so badly. She said, I just have to tell you that there's going to be a house built across the street from you, and it's going to be an A-frame, and she described the architecture, and she said, I wouldn't tell you this, but because I brought him to your house and jeopardized your life, I will tell you this house is going to be here, and she described it. And about 2-3 months later, the bulldozer came, and there were two homes across the street, and a driveway was cut in between them, and a house went up there. And there's more to this story, that a person moved in. She'd moved out from Texas. The purpose of that house was to keep track or tape record what was going in my home. And so when the house was all built, I went up there just to introduce myself. And on the mantle in the living room was this huge, big tape recorder, sort of like that TV movie or the movie you've seen. There's one about the cassettes and the tape recording neighbors close by, the Anderson tapes, I believe it was. And I just freaked out when I saw it. And I left my name and said hello. The woman was not home. Her parents were out here from Texas, and I had nothing to do with her. And the rest of the story, someday I'll tell you about it. I'll leave it at that point. But the reason I bring it up was then, a few years later, in 1981, there was a murder at Stanford campus again. Arliss Perry was murdered, and this was the same campus. The first murder, the Perloff girl, was a few years earlier, and 1973, this is quite a few years later, 1981. And I got some calls that the same people that were involved, not the young people, there was a big age span, but some of the people involved in the murder of Arliss Perry in 1974, who was killed at Stanford campus, were the organization people behind the Perloff murder at Stanford campus, where that guy had been at my house who had done that murder. And I was told that they were connected by higher-ups at a higher level, and that there were connections between the two Stanford campuses and the two murders. And then all of a sudden articles came out linking Son of Sam to the Stanford murders, which made it a little closer to the one that had been at my home a few years earlier. And the newspapers I had on World Watchers a long time ago in 1981, program number 516, an article by Jack Sirica, from the San Jose Mercury. That's the son of John Sirica, the judge, the Watergate judge, who was out here in San Jose. And he said David Berkowitz sat in a small interview room in attic of prison in New York in 1979, very nervously talking to two Santa Clara County Sheriff detectives. And they were talking about the killings in New York City and what he professed to know about the brutal killing of Arliss Perry, who was stabbed to death in 1974 in the Stanford Memorial Chapel. And she had been killed there at Stanford University. And by 1979, this time period, she died in 1974, and the police by 1979 were catching on to it. In 1981, there were more articles about it. But that murder in 1974, the other one was 73. The actual murders were pretty close together. And so the time period of one killed at Stanford campus, and this guy had been at my home, and this woman who had come there to help me with the research is telling me these stories. And then later, the next murder at Stanford campus, and that one is tied into Son of Sam and Anton LaVey and the Church of Set with Michael Aquino. And just to tell you a little bit more, that I'll update more about the house and the people and the circumstances, because this is very personal. This is something I've lived with and around me since this period of 1973 and 74. It's something that I would like to give more details, but obviously you understand why I can't. I called Maury Terry. I have his phone number in 1981, and I was telling about the Arliss Perry murder and the parallel and the connections of the government persons that were involved in the links to Charles Manson and the Manson family, and the connections of these various elements in the San Francisco, Los Angeles, California area, and Carmel, where some of these characters were members of the Manson family. My experiences with them here in California, because they were studying those problems in New York, and they involved the satanic rites and mass murders and high government officials and the military. And so I got into this very early, studying these matters because of personal experiences I was having here, and also because I continuously wanted to understand what was happening in our government. And the best way to understand it is to get know some of the characters involved. I'll tell you, it's pretty scary. Now, that book, The Ultimate Evil, I mentioned before, it's called An Investigation of America's Most Dangerous Satanic Cult by Maury Terry, and also this new one on Aleister Crowley, one of the most dangerous people in the world. This book, Doubleday, just came out this year, and this goes into extensive connections of the California-type terrorism linked to New York City and the relationship of the various persons coast to coast. Although Manson didn't know David Berkowitz, they had common denominators and people in common. So in the next weeks after Christmas, we'll go back to that. I'm going to leave the satanic and occult, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of overview of what I've lived with and dealt with in a way close by me, across the street, and I don't know what to make of it. As I say, I can't say too much at this time. Last week I referred to this Jeffrey McDonald, a physician from Princeton University, who got his MD. He was practicing, and he was stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and his wife and his pregnant wife and two daughters were killed, and he was charged. He said that there was a satanic cult that came in. They left all kinds of symbols of ritualism and Satanism, and that he was cut up, and he lost these members of his family, and he lost the ability to defend himself. He was decided to be guilty. He had one trial and a second trial, and then an author came by the name of Joe McGinnis, and Joe McGinnis is a writer who wanted to help McDonald. He said, I believe in you. I believe in what you're saying, such as the satanic cult and how the murders took place. So he got to know Jeffrey McDonald, and he talked to him for 4 years. And McDonald was sure that he was going to write a book telling his side of the story, how he's serving time and how that cult is out there doing their thing. And what happened was this man came out with a book. It was very popular for the last few years, a hardback book and paperback called Fatal Vision by this McGinnis. And instead of telling what Jeffrey McDonald told him happened to him and his family, this writer turned against him. Joe McGinnis turned against him and turned out a book and said, yep, he's guilty. And this is an interesting case because it just came before the courts. The writer was found guilty and had to give Jeffrey McDonald $325,000 because he came over under the pretense of trying to understand the case and then wrote a book that he was guilty. And last week I mentioned on the air Ted Gunderson, former FBI director of Memphis, Tennessee, of Los Angeles, and Dallas, who took on the case for Dr. McDonald. And he met a woman who said she was there at the time of the murders. And since then, this FBI agent has been hiding. The title of the LA Times article I mentioned last week and several syndicated from the Dallas Morning News said, FBI agent fears probe and a plot by the Satanic Cult. That even a head of the FBI who was even suggested to be director, only Mr. William Webster took over, he was supposed to be the director. He was so high up. And he's been chased by a Satanic Cult, and the article explains that the Justice Department is protecting the people that witnesses and persons that could have been involved, and letting Mr. McDonald stay in the prison for 3 lifetime sentences, which shows how high up it goes. Well, now I'm going to conclude this part of the program and let you call in. Before I conclude, we want to thank Coast Components at 684-1185, the Monterey Bay Area's distributor of electronic components. Thank you for the underwriting grant that brought you the past Hour of World Watchers. And the previous Hour of World Watchers was made possible in part by Lowdown, a leading manufacturer of microcomputer peripherals located in Scotts Valley. For more information, call 438-7400. And to remember John Lennon and his assassination that took place just 7 years ago tonight, I'll conclude this part of the program with a little bit of Imagine, and then we'll continue the talk show part of the program.